You're live. Okay, I might be live. Oh, I had. Well, I didn't know if I should, excuse me, put this off more or just do it now, since hardly anybody watched a few of the videos, but some people watched part of the last video. I try not to be redundant too much, but a lot of the other channels tend to put out like a lot of the same content over and over and over, and that's kind of why I don't name names, because you'll figure that out soon enough that maybe you don't need to see all 400 of their videos. Maybe 6 or 10 might suit you, depending on where you are in your writing journey. And of course, as always, this is applicable, I hope, to both screenwriters and novelists or other forms of entertainment writing. This is not going to be a complete catch-all, so I do still have notes for a couple other things. But I want to cover a couple different topics, and the heater came on, so I'm already sweating to death, so I might put on the hat, I might not. But we're definitely going to have at least one part, and so we're in part one. And both of them, or both of the main two parts, I should say, have been divided into 4 types of thing. So hence that makes some unification for this particular video, even though this video isn't on one subject alone, which I suppose if I wanted to make shorter videos and do it that way, I could, but I figure if you're really interested, you'll skip ahead to part 2 if you want to see what that part is more about than part 1 or whatever. Actually, there's a third thing. Well, it's kind of more of a joke, so I'm saving that. The first thing is revisiting stuff I talked about in at least 2 videos. I had basically boiled it down like most content creators do into the two methods. The 2 main methods are the pantser and the outliner, or can also be called the discovery versus the plotter. But in one video, it was suggested that there might actually be 4 methods, and the first could be called the crystallizer, and the second could be called the weaver. Okay. And in one of the videos, I had kind of hinted at me working in those methods, maybe in relation to considering myself more of a pantser than an outliner. So I don't know that they're necessarily separate and independent methods for an entire work, which was also the main point of the other thing, was that crystallizer is not necessarily an actual method that anybody could really follow from start to finish, although that might be kind of how they come up with ideas or brainstorm something from a seed into at least an outline or a synopsis. So I guess I have started some books with all 4 of these methods, as like I said, but the crystal, for me at least, would have become the weave or the pants, and the weave, as I described it, is still somewhat pants, but also with elements of outline for the formatting, because what I had said I often do is I'll have scenes that I know won't work in a thing, and I'll pull them out and stick them in something else. So the placement of the scenes as they are cobbled together, as I kind of explained in a previous video, might, like I said, I don't know if I qualify that as pants or outline, but I'm definitely more, I don't know if I necessarily have an outline, but I definitely have a story structure kind of in mind, or I wouldn't know where to place these scenes, right? Whereas other times I'm just putting them in a folder and looking at them again later and trying to figure out if they're any good. Whereas if I know it's good and I'm putting in an existing thing or trying to put several of them together, I don't know that's necessarily, like I said, an outline, but it's definitely not pants, because I'm not making it up as I go along. I'm putting it in a sequence. So that's weaving, maybe. So that maybe that's a third way instead of a fourth way, I guess, that I can consider legitimate method of workology. But again, I'm more doing that probably with screenplays than with fiction prose, just because I'm working on screenplays more often, maybe. I don't know. I didn't quantify and go back through and try and figure it out. And I won't say that I've done that with everything. It's more when something I know is too long, and then I'm hoping this thing will turn into something later. So, like I said, I don't automatically have two full things. Just because I pulled a bunch of junk out of this one doesn't mean it automatically becomes a whole full new thing, even though it's become a pretty significant seed for a new thing. Anyway, so in previous video, blah, 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 I mentioned only the two methods. In fact, because, as I said, most other writers aren't as prolific to have enough stuff lying around to weave new stories. You know, even I, like I said, struggle with this. So the idea that somebody else is going to come along and already have a backlog at a much younger age. Not that some of you won't have written a fair amount by the age of, mid-20s or whatever, but if you're just starting out and this is your first exposure to a YouTube how to write a book video kind of thing, you probably don't have very much stuff lying around to do this. Okay. So yes, most writers are not as prolific to have enough stuff lying around to weave new stories from full chapters and things. So more likely that they are pantsers by default, or outliners whom don't wish to admit that they're outliners because they're just lazy or sloppy about making their initial outlines, which is kind of how I started out, right? So I can relate. But you still have something of a plot and an ending in mind, just more of a revision method of getting there in the end than trying to figure it all out in advance. So you're considering yourself a pantser, but you're not really quite doing that either. You kind of know what your characters are. You kind of know what the situation is. So many will obviously argue that Stephen King is proof that one can be a pantser and still become a successful author. And I talked about him previously. Yes, but he's also likely the exception and not the rule. And therefore, if you start out pantsing and then bog down, more likely you will need to either scrap the project or go on back to the beginning and work out some kind of outline and figure out where you want the story to go before revisiting, the thing and trying to make it a complete work. And repeat for the next project, or just give up. Are you going to try and do it this way every time, or are you going to try and do outlines next time? Or really go off the seat of your pants and have no clue, but you need to write something, so you're just going to sit there and write. Obviously, again, the outline method is more likely to get you a concrete foundation for starting, even if that sounds boring. So yeah, you can repeat and rinse and lather for the next project, or you can just give up on the fantasy of being a novelist as a career and quit writing fiction for the goal of being a published writer or whatever, if you can never revise your stuff enough to get to the point where anybody else would even want to read it, much less publish it or pay you for it. Now, here's one of those kind of caveats, because people always say, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? And I'm not going to go into all those tangents because I already mentioned a bunch of them in previous videos. But like 150 years ago, the Dickens books, for example, were written as chapters in monthly periodicals or whatever, weekly, monthly, I don't know. So this method won't really work anymore today because you probably don't have a publication that wants to give you installments for however many months or weeks or years. So in those days, even if some chapters didn't quite fit the overall book, like there's that one part in Great Expectations where he visits the guy at the castle house and the guy shoots off the cannon, and it's just sort of there. It's just a bit of fluff. It doesn't affect the story. And then he makes the character immediately turn into a brick wall and all business again when he sees him again, because he knew that was just kind of a throwaway. That's slightly different than a modern day book when you're pulling out a chapter and publishing it in a periodical. It's like pre-promotion or a way to get a little bit upfront cash or kind of thing. Those can be standalone chapters that do fit into the novel, but they're a little more self-contained-ish, a little less cliffhanger-ish maybe, because you want it to fit, but you're presenting it basically as a short story. So you might have to revise it slightly to get it into the periodical from the way it appears in the book, but chances are it's going to have to fit into the book better than that weird Dickens chapter that we just talked about. Like, chances are an editor now would go, why is this chapter here with the guy in the cannon? Like, that would probably get chopped right out immediately. Okay. So yeah, even Kerouac did this, way back when with the Mexican Girl, before On the Road went to print, but he was still sort of mostly a pantser after that, and so like he's like one of the only ones I give a free pass to, because back in the day he was like the new thing, like nobody had really written a book like that before, so it was like fresh and new. Whereas he would unlikely have gotten the same treatment now. And as I discussed in a previous video, he was also previously published when he did that because he already had the Town and the City and blah, blah, blah. So, like I said, I'm trying not to be too redundant. Okay, so anyway, so in the one other video, I like to throw in there nuggets in with my nuggets just so you can't say that I didn't give you any useful information besides my opinion. But the pros of being a plotter is less revision and easier to revise, less writer's block theoretically, and a faster first draft completed, which again is one of my goals and that I want to impart, that I think that should be your main preliminary focus, is getting a thing that's up to length, that's you can say you accomplished it at least, right? Cons of plotting: more significant upfront investment, the less fun part, right? It's cumbersome and tiresome, more like doing homework than writing. So yeah, I agree with that to a degree. Like I said, that's how I started out and I hated it. And I still don't really outline the way they want me to, per se. Obviously, completely true for me when 20, but how much the writing turned into total mush and not really good, yes. I mentioned that, of course, before, but here we are restating this. The first draft, that much needs to be thrown out after all, very often is the result you end up with when you... Okay, so then outline, restrictive, harder to make significant structural change if change your mind about some arc or character or whatever. So this is is that supposed to be the con of outline instead of the pro, I guess? Risk of cookie cutter book, formulaic. Again, a screenplay, though, I kind of think they're a little more formulaic by nature. Genres, I think, are a little bit more formulaic by nature. How you break out of that is kind of a skill you might acquire or luck into on accident once and then never repeat or something. I'm not sure. Like I said, I talked about this also too in genres in other videos previously, so I won't go into that over much. Pros of pantsing: creative freedom and flexibility, shorter lead time. You're writing already. Yes. Even if you have no idea what the hell you're going to do in the next chapter. Fresher ideas. Nothing, according to Stephen King anyway, nothing rigid. The story just evolves in unexpected ways. But then again, like I said, it might be hard to weave in things that fit with other things later when you have to try and make the logical things all make sense. It might be a bit more of a challenge. More creative energy and engagement, pleasurable and stimulating to proceed in this method. Cons of pantsing: more extensive revisions, like I said. And this is the truth. The revision is the bane of anyone who just wants to go on to the next thing because they already wrote that thing. And like I said, Kerouac kind of got away with it, but you probably won't. Nowadays we call it ADHD, etc. Like I said, that worked because he had that first big success and it wasn't his first book and blah, blah, blah. Pacing issues, plot holes, incomplete character arcs. So yes, these are all cons when you aren't really, you're writing it as you go and you aren't really paying attention again to how it all fits together per se. First and second half inconsistency. And this was a big thing in one of those very famous screenwriting books where he talked about how they would have this super tight first 10 pages. And then after that, the whole thing would just go haywire. And you'd be like, what happened? You were writing a good story and now it's all mush. And that was even where they had plotted somewhat, I assume, right? But they started going off on tangents. They started introducing 50 million new characters because you thought you needed more characters, where if you had outlined it more, you would be introducing key characters and then less insignificant ones, theoretically. Or you might know which character is the antagonist. Oh, it turns out it was Aunt Shirley all along, not these other four people. Who knows, you know. It's been a while since I've had to deal with some of those kind of things. But like I talked about in the one video, I have two perfect sets of dialogue that I wanted to attribute to the same person. But this person would never say this and also say this. But if I invent a new character to say this, then they came out of nowhere. Who is, you know, you're going to have to figure out a way to introduce that character sooner and make them significant in a smaller way so that they can deliver this amazing line and then go away. You know, whatever. Let's see. Then the next issue was writer's block, waiting for inspiration. Again, where most ADHD kind of writers will spend their time ignoring that one and working on this one instead of going back and revising that one that they've already been working on. Because like I said, you have this great nugget of this new idea, shiny, even though this isn't finished, but I can work on this at least for a while. And that's not always the worst thing, because sometimes you need a break from that thing. But you have to know when it's time to take a break from this thing and go back to that thing while you have this inspiration and this energy, blah, blah, blah. Takes much longer once initial rush wears off. Again, yes, you're bogging down, or you didn't really know where you were going to go once you got to that kind of midpoint. The one creator is redundant with her points because they kind of say the same thing in different words, so I've tried to condense that a little bit here. Here's a method that they didn't mention, though, and I don't know that this is a crystallizer. Maybe. I think it's more of a weaver still, just because instead of taking existing scenes, I'm taking existing memories, or I or you or whoever. So why I can often write without an outline is because I'm writing from real life. The method, the Kerouac method, again, where he's fictionalizing what happened. So they don't really mention that. So that's my Easter egg. So it's actually the fifth or the third or the whatever method. But the issue we often have here that they probably address in some video that I haven't seen yet, is when the writer is always arguing with the reader. You finally get somebody to read your work and they're going, this doesn't seem real. This seems, and you're like, but this is how it really happened, you know. And so you get into this kind of fiction versus reality paradox. Or when you want to put an artificial happy ending because you don't want to admit in the book that you got dumped or whatever, or you want to write how you wished it had went when it was really unrequited all along, if it's a manic pixie dream girl love story or whatever, which is like the most, we'll get to this in part 2 a little bit more. But when fictionalizing, knowing when to bend the rules or alter reality, you know, should work better. Or when you're just being unrealistic, like what I talked about in the last video about the Jello helmets, that nobody got that far, I'm sure. And so if it's that unrealistic, there's no suspension of disbelief. The reader cannot engage because they know, you know, you're not an astronaut, alien, or whatever. But again, I was trying to add absurd examples rather than real examples more in that video than I wanted to do here. But I don't really have any examples off my top of my head too much. But, you know, that hot gold digger really wanted to date that poor, ugly hunchback troll because he was broke but funny. Might be a bit of a stretch, etc. So how even the manic pixie dream girl trope has its limits or whatever. So that brings us actually to, oh my goodness, it all ties in. Part two. We'll put on the hat for a minute. I just really wanted to absorb some sweat. It's just not the greatest thing to admit, but that's life. 20 minutes. That's not terrible for me. So the one video, he had listed 4 types of books that Manic Pixie Dream Girl was not listed as one of the 4 types that you will write or may write or most likely have written or started writing. The 2 on the ends was unfinished and finished, being the opposites of the end, which I guess they mean that if you write long enough, you'll end up with a bunch of unfinished things, but hopefully you'll end up with some finished things. I'm clarifying what I think they meant. My memories, I watched these a week ago and then I forget half of what I was talking about, so it happens. But in the middle, at least one of the categories was the endless revision, which technically is just unfinished, but he skirted the categories that I expected to hear about of the 4 actual types of books, meaning I thought maybe he meant something along the lines of genres or whatever. Like if you're an amateur, you're more likely to write Manic Pixie Dream Girls because you don't know anything about NASA, or you don't know anything about the military, or you don't know anything about running a mega business or whatever while being on vacation in the Maldives or something. Like you don't have that personal experience and you're going to really struggle writing that kind of thing, especially your first time out. I thought that was where the video was going to go, and then it didn't really go there. Oh, this is just an aside. I had written contractions that really make got stand out from the last video. I put this in the description afterward, but I'll say it here just because it didn't get said there. It's got is literally where we are burying the has for in favor of the got that is redundant. So I have got a hat on. I have a hat on is the more proper way to say it. But again, in dialogue, we don't always want it to be that proper. 9 mistakes that make readers hate your main character. Did I? Okay, we're not doing that. And then I had 3 types of voice. Not a complete thing. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to go into that. Why do I feel like I can't remember if I did this video? Okay, I guess I'll have to get into that. This is a long. Right. Okay. So I guess this will be a shorter video then, because I'm not going to go into this. I have in the future that, and then I had this is okay. Maybe I should go into this since we're on and save that. Okay, yeah. This was more recent and all that. So lucky us. Let me close out of this. We'll do part three. Part two is really short. Turns out, didn't expect that because I thought I had written more. But no sense in, like I said, belaboring a point that might be mentioned elsewhere. But instead of 4 things, now we're talking about 5 things. 5 things that will ruin a novel or your novel. And this is plot and character issues. And protagonist lacks agency. Okay. Heroism requires action. And here's where the hero always kind of believes he's right, or the villain also may always believe he's right, that kind of thing. So this is me kind of just listing stuff that's useful, but I have some other stuff. Okay, too low or poorly defined stakes. I did a whole video about raising stakes and all that based on that other video before. If the stakes are not proper, the reader doesn't care about your stakes or whatever, for whatever reason. We talked about the DNF in the previous video, so I don't need to go into that. I don't think too much. 3 character or plot arcs that move way too quickly. That was one of the things they talked about in comparing the novel to the novella, was that a novella, you're kind of focused more on one thing and less subplots or whatever. So in that, you might have to speed up the narrative and the exposition a bit to kind of get to the point. But a novel, even if the ending is unsatisfying in terms of, you know, it was sad and we wanted happy, or in terms of, you know, the character, you know, failed in their quest or whatever the deal was, we still want to feel like the resolution was complete, that everything was covered, right? That the characters did what they were going to do in that space and time. And I had talked about this elsewhere. That'll come up again in the next video, I think. They always talking about the character arc, like as if the character always has to have this arc. And I argue that James Bond typically doesn't have any real arc. He's the same character, and that's kind of the point of James Bond. So it depends. So you don't always have to like worry about that. And if somebody's trying to make you do that, maybe not. But yeah, another issue I had was with Star Wars, and I had talked about this maybe a long time ago in the Star Wars video, where part of the thing that made the first Star Wars kind of compelling is that these characters came together and they didn't even really like each other all that much. They were rubbing each other the wrong way constantly. You know, watch your mouth, kid, or I'm going to, you know, boot you out. You can hitchhike home. And Princess Leia telling him that's a piece of junk. How did you get here in one piece? And all that kind of thing. And I'd rather kiss a Wookiee and yada, yada, yada. Whereas in the newer ones, not the prequels, but the sequels, the characters were all like, oh, hey, you're my new best friend. Cool. Let's go fight the Empire together. Like, oh, like they didn't even need a minute of adjusting. It was just like, you, me, okay, simpatico. Which guy is she in love with? Oh, who knows? Whatever. You know, kind of a mess. So yeah, that wasn't handled very well at all in which movie was that? It wasn't Rise of Skywalker. It was the other title. All the titles were wrong too. There was a whole video that some guy did where he pointed out that the titles would have been better if they rearranged them. So I don't even remember which one that was, but but they had the same problem, I think, in Rogue One almost. Subplots and such need time to grow and develop. Agree. Okay. 4. That was 3. Now we're in 4. Story lacks structure. Whether it's a 5, 7, or 15 beat, 3 act, etc. He says conflict and resolution, tension and intensity build. Does that say builds? Maybe, etc. I can't read my own writing. That's the problem when I don't type these things up and stuff. Anyway, yeah, what I wanted to talk about in relation to that was I showed this in the screenplay videos. The 2 of the thumbnails were these kind of standard story plot structures. You don't automatically have to have like a little bit up and a little bit down constantly. I suppose there's some stories that could happen like that, or some sequences where that could work. But typically, I think if we're going to ratchet up, like, oh, we have a good scene where we kind of plateau at a positive spot. And then instead of going straight down, we have another positive scene. Hey, that's okay. But the higher we climb, then the farther I think is typically expected to fall, I think was kind of what that one graph is supposed to represent. And I didn't really go into that at the time. Another Easter egg. Lucky you. Intensity. I'm pretty sure this is builds. But yeah, again, if you don't have the proper story beats, you don't have the proper character arcs and all that, then of course your thing is going to feel unsatisfying in the wrong way, which we talked about in the previous video based on the other guy's video. Okay. 5, keep the reader in the dark. Information withheld too long can ruin your novel because they're curious and they're just never getting any answers at all. Like, okay, at what point do we learn anything useful at all? That this isn't just me trying to figure out what you're trying to tell me. Again, I don't know how many books actually get to print with that. If you're writing a first draft, like, and the readers are confused, then it's a pretty good point to learn. I don't think you'll ever get published if your book is that vague or whatever. And then, of course, the downside of that was what is that? I can't read what that says. Curious and I don't know what that is, but no, overloaded. So the opposite being too much information too soon, too many info dumps, that kind of thing. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But again, that's not the kind of thing that's going to get published either. And again, I would say most first drafts are going to be too short. So if you're worried that you're putting in too much information, you're probably not, unless you're really putting in too much information. And then again, a reader will bog down and tell you right away, oh man, I could not even get through the first chapter. It's just too much. So yeah, you might have to pay a beta reader to try and cut through that with a knife. Again, it's a little easier if you have a classroom and they're kind of forced to read your stuff, or supposed to be forced to read your stuff. Maybe they won't read your stuff, but at least the teacher who's grading you will still have to slog through your stuff. Curious and I don't know what that word is. It doesn't matter. Okay. So yeah, I think, like I said, I agreed with most of these 5 points. So I thought I should add them in here, even though I didn't argue or rebut them like I usually do with stuff. Which is kind of the point of doing these as rebuttals, but hey, that's life. And I didn't think that was worth making a totally separate video about, though, because I didn't have that much rebuttal. So there you go. So better here it is if you find it. Excuse me. I'm thirsty and I'm burping at the same time, which is always a great way to end a video, but not a super endless long lecture this time, and left enough stuff for next time that I don't think I covered yet. Like I said, I don't want to go on too many random tangents on these things. Try to keep the topics more or less related. So as usual, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments and I'll try and answer them. They might already be answered in a previous video because, like I said, this one was kind of a half slop catch-all thing anyway. But if I don't put out new content, I won't draw in new viewers or something maybe. So I'll try and keep doing these every couple days or every week or something. And we'll figure it out. And again, yes, if you are a beginning writer, I do have a couple things that might be a little bit more essential viewing than this one, but the previous video that is like an hour long, maybe slightly more essential, but you might not want to sit through the whole hour. But then if you go back 2 or 3 videos or something where I'm talking about how to begin novels and that kind of thing. Again, the things about the screenplay structure, like I said, I'm not going to go into all this. But if you go back and watch those and I didn't manage to answer the question, then definitely hit me up and say, hey, how come you did 2 whole videos and you still didn't talk about this? Because maybe there's something significant. I forgot. Okay. So that's that for now, and happy Thursday and all that.